In the dead of night, beneath the shadow of frost-covered mountains, a woman's scream pierced the silence. But this was no ordinary birth. The men gathered in that cold stone room weren't family. They weren't there to celebrate. They were inspectors, sent by the state, and their eyes held no warmth, no mercy, only calculation. When the child finally emerged into the world, the mother reached for her baby with trembling hands. But she was stopped. There would be no embrace, not yet. First came the examination. The elders took the infant under harsh torchlight, turning its tiny body in their weathered hands. They checked its limbs for strength, its chest for breath, its eyes for clarity. Every feature was scrutinized, every imperfection noted, and then came the judgment every Spartan mother feared. If the child was deemed weak, malformed, or unfit for war, it would not see another sunrise. There would be no funeral, no prayers, only a dark chasm at the base of Mount Taygetus where unwanted infants disappeared into legend. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was Sparta. And in Sparta, the state didn't just govern your taxes or your land. It governed your body, your bloodline, your very right to exist. For centuries, the world has marveled at Spartan warriors, those bronze-clad titans who held the line at Thermopylae, who never retreated, who turned battle into art. But behind that legend lies something far darker, a machine, a system so ruthlessly designed that it turned human reproduction into a military operation, childhood into a battlefield, and an entire civilization into a breeding ground for perfect soldiers. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on that machine. You're about to witness how Sparta engineered human beings like weapons, controlled intimacy like policy, and sacrificed its soul for strength. This is the truth behind the myth. This is the price of perfection. If you're ready to explore the darkest chapters of history, to see the real cost of power and the human stories buried beneath empires, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because at Grim History, we don't just tell you what happened. We show you why it still matters. Let's go back to the beginning. Not to battlefields or glory, but to something far more intimate and controlled. Because in Sparta, warfare didn't start on the battlefield. It started in the bedroom. Spartan society operated on a principle that sounds almost scientific today, but was brutal in its execution. Selective breeding. This wasn't romance. This wasn't even about family. Marriage in Sparta existed for one purpose only, to produce strong children for the state. Young women, often as young as 18, were paired with men in their 30s, men who had already proven themselves in combat. But even this pairing wasn't based on love or choice. It was orchestrated by officials who believed they could engineer better warriors through careful genetic selection. Here's where it gets stranger. Spartan marriages didn't even resemble what we think of as partnerships. Newlywed men didn't live with their wives. They remained in military barracks, visiting their spouses only in secret, often under cover of darkness. Some historians believe this was intentional, a way to keep desire high and encounters brief, focused solely on procreation. Intimacy was regulated, timed, monitored. Even the act of creating life was a duty to the state, but it didn't stop there. If a husband was old or weak, Sparta encouraged his wife to sleep with a younger, stronger man. Yes, you heard that right. Adultery, in most cultures a crime, was in Sparta a civic responsibility. The state didn't care about bloodlines in the traditional sense. It cared about results. If another man could produce a better warrior, then that was the union that mattered. Jealousy, possessiveness, personal attachment, all of it was considered weakness, obstacles to the greater goal. Women in Sparta were trained almost as rigorously as men, not to fight in wars but to bear strong children. They exercised, wrestled, ran, and participated in athletic competitions, often in minimal clothing, which scandalized other Greek city-states. But Sparta didn't care about scandal. It cared about creating mothers who were physically capable of surviving childbirth and producing resilient offspring. Spartan women were perhaps the most physically empowered women in the ancient world. But that empowerment came with a dark bargain. Their bodies were not their own. They belonged to the state's vision of genetic perfection. Now let's talk about what happened after birth. That inspection we opened with? It was called the Gerousia examination, conducted by a council of elders. Newborns were brought before them, stripped naked, assessed like livestock. If the child passed, it was returned to its mother. If it failed, it was taken to a place called Apothetai, a chasm on Mount Taygetus. There, infants deemed too weak or deformed were abandoned to die from exposure or fall. For centuries, this practice was treated as legend, dismissed as propaganda by Sparta's enemies. But in the late 20th century, archaeologists found bones, small bones. At the base of that mountain, the myth was real. This wasn't just about eliminating the weak. It was about sending a message to every Spartan from birth. Your value is determined by your usefulness to the state. You are not born with rights. You earn them. And if you can't, you don't survive. Those who did survive faced a childhood unlike any other. At age 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and enrolled in the Agoge, a brutal state-run education system designed to strip away individuality and forge obedience. They were organized into packs, given minimal food, and taught to steal to survive. If they were caught stealing, they weren't punished for the theft. They were punished for getting caught. The lesson was clear. Cunning and ruthlessness were virtues. Weakness and failure were not. The boys slept on beds made of reeds they gathered themselves, often without blankets, even in winter. They were encouraged to fight each other, to form hierarchies, to compete viciously for status. Older boys were given authority over younger ones, creating a cycle of dominance and submission. There was no room for compassion, no space for doubt. Every day was a test. Every night was survival. One of the most disturbing rituals was the contest of endurance held at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Boys were whipped, sometimes to the point of death, while spectators watched. The goal wasn't punishment, it was performance. To show no pain, no fear, no crack in the armor. To endure suffering without flinching was the ultimate proof of Spartan discipline. Some boys died during these rituals. They were honored as heroes. Their suffering was celebrated as sacrifice. Girls, while not subjected to the Agoge, were also raised under strict control. They trained in athletics, learned to read and write, more than most Greek women, and were taught that their duty was to bear warriors. They were told that their worth lay in their ability to produce sons who would die well in battle. Spartan mothers were famous for their farewell to sons going to war. Come back with your shield, or on it, meaning return victorious or dead. Anything else was disgrace. By the time a Spartan boy reached manhood, he had been so thoroughly conditioned that individuality was almost erased. He thought in terms of the unit, the phalanx, the state. Personal desires were secondary. Personal fear was shameful. And personal life, the relationships, the choices, the freedom most of us take for granted, simply didn't exist. But here's the paradox. This system, for all its cruelty, worked. For a time, Sparta became the most feared military power in Greece. Their soldiers were legendary. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans held off tens of thousands of Persians, buying time for Greece to rally. Their reputation alone was often enough to win battles. Enemies would retreat rather than face the Spartan phalanx. The machine had produced exactly what it intended: perfect soldiers. So what went wrong? How did a system so ruthlessly efficient lead to collapse? The answer is as tragic as it is inevitable. Sparta bred itself into extinction. The rigid social structure meant that only a small elite, called the Spartiates, held full citizenship and could serve as warriors. To maintain this status, families needed land and wealth. But Sparta's constant warfare and the loss of men in battle meant fewer and fewer families could sustain that status. The population of full citizens began to shrink. By the time of Sparta's defeat at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, there were fewer than 1,000 Spartiates left. They had become victims of their own selectivity. Moreover, the emphasis on militarism left Sparta culturally stagnant. While Athens produced philosophy, art, drama, and innovation, Sparta produced only soldiers. When the world began to change, when warfare evolved, when new strategies and technologies emerged, Sparta couldn't adapt. It had sacrificed flexibility for discipline, creativity for obedience, and in the end, that rigidity became its tomb. There's also the human cost, the one that doesn't show up in history books. The mothers who lost their children to the chasm. The boys who couldn't endure and were cast out as inferiors, living as outcasts in their own land. The men who died young in wars that served no purpose but pride. The women who bore child after child, hoping one would be strong enough to survive. Sparta didn't just control bodies. It controlled souls. What Sparta created wasn't a society. It was a military cult, one that consumed its own people in pursuit of an impossible ideal. And when that ideal finally crumbled, there was nothing left. No art to remember. No philosophy to inspire. Just ruins and stories of warriors who were more myth than human. So here's the question we're left with. Was it worth it? Did Sparta's sacrifices buy them anything lasting? Or did they trade their humanity for a fleeting moment of glory, only to be forgotten as a cautionary tale? History doesn't give us easy answers, but it does give us patterns. And the pattern here is clear. Any society that treats people as instruments, that values strength over compassion, that engineers perfection at the cost of individuality, that society is doomed, not because it's immoral though it is, but because it's unsustainable. Human beings are not machines. We are fragile, complex, imperfect. And any system that denies that will eventually break. Sparta tried to create super soldiers. What it created instead was a monument to the dangers of dehumanization, a warning written in blood and stone. And perhaps that's the real legacy of Sparta. Not its warriors, but its collapse. Not its strength, but its emptiness. The price of perfection, as it turns out, is everything.